first of 3 pieces for me. It is my planar element. And a couple of things you'll notice right away is that it's put together very quickly. I used Scotch tape so that it will come apart easily. It's also easy to put together. Just has 4 sides and a bottom. And what you'll also notice is that it's not perfect. It's pretty close. It's as close to square as I could get it. There will be a lot of room in finishing these to make them more square and more what you're hoping them to be. But I would try to get your molds as square and flat as possible. It'll just save work later. So the first step is to, once the plaster has hardened, is to peel away and remove the cardboard like this, and you'll see that it's very, the paper has stuck to the plaster, which is totally fine. If you are looking to have a nice clean plaster cast, you can use mold release agents and things like that. But for our purposes, this is actually okay. We're going to sand it down and refine the piece a little bit more with scrapers and sandpaper. So you can see here I'm actually starting to peel away some of the paper already here. So I am going to grab a butter knife really quickly, which I found is actually the best tool for preliminary scraping and cleaning. I'm taking as much as I can off by hand. It just kind of falls away. So let me grab the butter knife really quickly. I'll be right back. Something like this, pulled it right out of my drawer. So plaster, once plaster is hard in this way, it is not actually water soluble anymore. So what I would recommend is to lightly run a very fine, slow stream of cool water over your form when you're stripping the mold. And actually using the water, what this does is it helps use the water to clean away the paper and get a better sense of what your final piece is going to look like. So this is very thin. This is about a 1/4 inch actually. And you can see it's also variable. The edges are a little high. But for the most part, it's pretty true and pretty square, which is great. And I'm just going to use the serrated edge of the butter knife for scraping. I'm just going to kind of work it away like this, and you'll get a hang of it. Get the hang of it, I think, pretty quickly. What you may want to do is do a test cast, just something of any size, and try it out. Like most things that involve craft, there are a few better ways than just diving right in and trying to get good results. So I'm scraping it down and using my eye, I get it nice and flat, kind of scraping away the high spots and the sharp edges. And I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time on the back here. It looks like the paper really stuck, which is, again, totally fine. So what the water does is it also, the paper will soften and release from the plaster when it's wet, which really helps a lot. I can even rub it with my hands here, and you can see it just rolls right away. So again, I would recommend maybe doing a test, one experiment. Take the time to make one mold of one piece and just get a feel for how the plaster behaves, what it can and can't do, and what kind of steps are involved in removing the paper. I'm not actually using the knife at all here. You can see I'm just, now that the paper is wet, I'm just using my fingers to roll the paper off the surface. So this is really hard at this point. It is hard, it's brittle. Plaster is very brittle. Plaster of Paris, I should say, is very brittle when it hardens, which is useful for holding forms and for making models. I'm kind of scraping this way and truing it up as I work, looking for a nice straight line. But it is fragile. I could break this very easily. Some have compared hardened plaster of Paris to marble, what a lot of sculptors use. So sculptors who work in marble will make their initial cast in plaster, and they can work with the plaster, and it will behave in a way very similar to marble, which is to say that it's both hard and also quite soft. You don't need a lot of heavy machinery or tools to work it. In fact, it will mar and abrade and sort of can see here or not, but I'm actually taking off substantial amounts of plaster with the serrated edge of this butter knife. So that gives you a sense of how this can work. And again, experimentation is your best friend in working in this way. Kind of just diving right in and paying attention to how the materials are behaving, and knowing that if it doesn't work the first time, if it breaks or cracks or something happens that you weren't expecting, you can always do it again. In fact, I would count on that. Probably you would expect that you'll have to recast some of your pieces at least twice, maybe 3 times, to get the results that you need, because each time that you do it, you're learning a little bit more about how to get better results. Okay, I'm going to continue to work on this, so in the images that will follow, you can understand what process went into getting a finer finish, but you can see the starting to get the paper off here, and everything from this point forward probably doesn't need to happen under the water. In fact, I think I'm going to stop now. Most of the paper is off, the edges are pretty clean. I'm going to set this aside and let it dry, and then do the rest with sandpaper. And I'll have a quick demonstration about how to do that in just a second. All right. So as you're working towards finishing your final plaster rectilinear volume model, I would strongly recommend that you work incrementally, that you cast first one piece, assess it, figure out whether it works, see if you need to cast it again, and then cast a second piece, and then the third piece, rather than casting all 3 at once. So this is a final model. It has a couple of balance points, which are part of the project description. In general, it's a really good way to organize your model. One of the many external criteria that we're using. But what's important to remember is that this started from 3 separate pieces, and I'd like to talk about that really quickly. So you've already seen the casting of this planar piece here, and what I've done is I've made a decision about proportions based on my initial study model here, and I'm working on this planar element that is then going to have a small volume attached to it here. So really important to remember that this is not, model making in this way is generative in the sense that it's not working from a specific idea and then trying to make that idea into a model. What I'm doing is I'm generating an idea, like this little study model, and then I'm examining it, making some assessments about how successful I think it is, things I may or may not change, and then advancing that thinking and making another model like this. So already it's going to be a little bit thicker, which is fine. Exactly what the proportions are not as important as making decisions based on the piece that you're working on for what is best for your final model. So what I've done is I've drawn in pencil on this planar piece an approximation of a size that will go here, like that. So the second piece that I'm going to cast, I've made a quick little mold of it here. It's approximately the right width, approximately what I'd like to see for the proper height that I'm working with. And it's very simple. It's again, just like the other one, it's 4 sides and a bottom held together with Scotch tape. It's a little box. You can see it's pretty, it's a very temporary. It just needs to be enough to hold the plaster. So once I have these pieces together, the next thing to do is to actually mix the plaster. And you can see it's powder form. I'm just using a very inexpensive little Tupperware tub for this. So I have the plaster. I probably have too much plaster here and a little bit of water. There is no exact proportion for mixing plaster of Paris. So what I've done is I've mixed a little bit of plaster and a little bit of water, and another reason why it's important to experiment is to get a first-hand experience with exactly how much water you need. For the curing process, it doesn't matter if you have a lot of water or a little water. The plaster will eventually cure as long as it's not too liquidy. It'll just take a little longer to dry. So generally speaking, what you're looking to do is make a mixture of plaster that will work for what it is that you want to mold. In this case, I'd like it to be kind of liquidy, not too thick and chunky. I would like it to be something that I can actually pour into the mold. This is looking pretty good. Again, if you experiment with a couple of these first, it will be very helpful to kind of get a sense of how much water you need. If this were too thin, I could add a little more plaster powder. If it were still too thick, I could continue to add a little bit of water, but I think this will be fine. And you can see I'm just using an old fork for this. Any utensil will work. You can rinse it when you're done. And I'm just going to pour it in there like this. Something like that. You can see it's kind of thick. That's probably pretty good. It looks like a little dollop of ice cream. So this is actually a technique for casting anything liquid in this way, is you kind of vibrate it, jiggle it, just kind of shaking it like this. What ends up happening is that the somewhat viscous, almost gelatinous plaster material settles in and fills the little corners and levels itself on the top. It's called self-leveling, so something like this. And again, as you've seen in the previous, the planar piece video, it doesn't need to be exact. It was my best effort at getting it kind of square and approximately the right proportion. And then the next thing is to cast it kind of quickly. Don't spend too much time on this, because once you break the molds off of it, there's going to be a lot of room to finish it and make it exactly the right proportion. So eventually this piece will go into that notch like that. And I am looking to build something like this little study model. So as soon as this dries, we'll take the mold off and finish it similarly to this one. Okay. So this little piece is now thoroughly dry, as you can see. It's very small. And I am going to do to this what we did to the other planar piece. Take the mold off. I'm over the sink so that I can rinse it. And I'm just going to peel the cardboard off and see how it looks. So as I expected, the cardboard is sticking, and it's also quite irregular. You can see the edges there, which is totally fine, because I'm going to treat this as a piece of sort of rough material that then I can refine and make into what I need it to be. And when I say refine it, I mean I'm going to make it more square to itself, and the edges a little sharper, and just clean it up. And the first thing I'm going to do is run it under water to get the paper off, and then clean it by scraping it a little bit with this butter knife. And then what we will do is look at how to continue to shape this once it's dry by using 80 grit sandpaper. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn a light bit of water there, a little cool stream, start shaving it off a little bit. It just takes practice, so remember, plaster is very inexpensive, as is corrugated cardboard, so perhaps it would be a good idea, if you're feeling at all uncomfortable about this or not getting the results you want, is to do a couple of samples. Make a little rectangle that is, maybe it's even sort of an approximation of one of the shapes you need, or it could just be a random size. Make a mold, tape it together with Scotch tape. And so again, the molds are just going to be 4 sides and a bottom, so it's open on the top, so you're making like a little tray. So mold and form, by the way, are used interchangeably. Gets a little bit confusing when you talk about form as in being this block, and form as in being the cardboard vessel that you actually cast the plaster in. So mold or form, both are used interchangeably in different contexts. So this is getting better, pretty quick, partially because it's very small. I would say this is about 1 1/4 inches by 3/4 of an inch, 3/4 this way and maybe 1 1/4 inches that way. One of the nice things about a butter knife is that it's serrated. Serrated refers to the little rough parts here on the edge of the blade that are used for cutting. They're not sharp, but they are like little saw blades. And what those serrations do is they make a pattern on the surface of your plaster, and I would just let that be. It's really beautiful. It's actually a very traditional way to finish plaster. Sculptors, Michelangelo and the others up to the current day, cast their first figures and forms out of plaster before going on to marble or bronze, perhaps. But in finishing it with kind of a roughing tool like this, it gives a surface texture that when it is, so I'm sort of turning the piece and scraping, it creates a kind of a random pattern on it. And I'll try to get a close-up photograph of the pattern on it. But what that does is it helps your finish feel more uniform, even though it's still fairly rough, if that makes sense. Maybe if you're familiar with the flocking that goes on the ceiling of a house sometimes, the spray flocking, the texturing is similar to that. It achieves a similar effect. It sort of hides imperfections. Texturing in general is used to do that on a wide range of products and wall surfaces, etc. So this is looking really good. I think I'm just going to call that good. And then we'll move on to sandpaper. So sandpaper, sheets of sandpaper, are typically around 8.5 by 11 inches, kind of like a standard sheet of paper. And one of the methods for using sandpaper is to actually cut it into what's called quarter sheets. So what I've done here is I've used just the edge of the table, and I've folded them and then ripped them along the edge of the paper. You could also cut them with scissors. That would work as well too, but it just helps save your sandpaper and actually work in manageable little pieces like this. So that's what I would recommend working with. This is 80 grit sandpaper. You can see the number on the back. It's actually a P80 coarse removal sandpaper. Sandpaper is measured by its coarseness. So the lower the number, the coarser the sandpaper. And the coarsest sandpaper, which has actually very few applications, is, I think it's 30 or 40. It goes 30, 40, 60, 80, which is kind of a standard average roughing paper. 80, 120, 220, 320, 420, and on up into the thousands for very fine polishing. So 80 grit is what I would recommend for this. If you don't have 80, 120 will work as well. So this little demonstration is just to talk about some tips and strategies for getting good results when you're sanding. So often when you're sanding, some people will use what's called a sanding block. You can put a piece of wood perhaps behind this like this and sand. What that does is it gives a firm backing on the paper as opposed to your fingers. So you can see the sandpaper is curved here. So if I were to sand this with my finger like this, generally speaking, the surface that you're sanding will take the shape of your tool. So this is rounded. So I want this to be flat as possible. So what I'm going to do, and this is actually really handy, is to use the table as a surface. So rather than sanding the object with the paper, I'm actually going to lay the sandpaper flat on the table and use that, and then run my form, in which case this is the planar form that I cast earlier, across the sandpaper. And what you'll find right away is that Plaster of Paris is very soft, relatively speaking. So I'm just going to run it very lightly and use a nice even pressure. What that does is it gets a nice flat edge. It takes away any of the curvature that might have been on this and just makes the edge straight. It will probably have a little bit of texture, but that's fine. I might even be able to do this, for example, run it in circles. But in this case, on the edges, I'm going to run it nice and slow and let the paper, with very light pressure, let the paper take the plaster of Paris away. Okay, so that's looking pretty straight. And you can see there's a curve on this probably. The corners are a little high. I can see that with my eye, so I'm going to place that down here and I'm going to work it by eye and run it across the sandpaper, kind of feeling for that flattening out. That looks a lot better already. It's a pretty quick process, really. So something like this. I'm also paying attention to holding the piece of plaster perpendicular to the surface of the table, because that's what I'm trying to achieve, is a nice rectilinear shape. So that's getting a lot more straight. So I'm going to do that really quickly on all the edges first. 1, 2, 3. This one's quite curved. You can see the corner's really high right here. So I'm going to do that also. All right, so that's pretty good. I'm going to keep turning it like this until the edges are nice and straight. What I'm looking for is to try to get these corners square. And you can actually use your triangle to measure those, or use your eye, or use a grid. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is clean my sandpaper. And this is very important. What I would do is I would use a plate or some surface to actually place the dust onto. So for example, I have a plate here and I can just shake it out like that. And that should go in the trash. Really easy to make a big mess with plaster of Paris, and which isn't to say you can't clean that up, but if you just kind of try to keep things tidy, you're gonna get the best results. So now I'm gonna lay this flat. Same strategy. What I'm looking to do is to get this even as much as possible. It's a little thinner here and a little thicker there. So I'm gonna take this and rub it in a circular motion and look at it. It looks pretty good. Starting to take some surface off there. You can see it's sanded here but not there, which is exactly what I want. So sanding this surface flat, and this was the mark where I laid out where that next small piece is going to go. I'm actually going to sand this side too. I'll probably sand away that pencil mark, but that's going to be okay. Check my work, that's looking pretty good. And you see what it did here is it actually took plaster of Paris off this corner, and it left that because this was high, meaning there was a curvature like this, and so it actually took that surfacing off. And I can sight down it. It's looking pretty good, pretty flat, pretty even. It's a little bit uneven there. You can see it's a little fatter there, so I'm just going to hit it one more time. Right there. I think you'll be surprised, hopefully pleasantly surprised, to see how easily the plaster of Paris sands. That is probably going to be about as good as I can get it for now. You are welcome to make these as precise and perfect as you can. What I have found is that in any sort of craft like this, it is very effective to try to get as close as you can to perfect, and then sort of develop a sense for when it's perfect enough. All that you're trying to achieve here is that it reads clean, thoughtfully put together, kind of well finished. If it has eccentricities and some warps and things like that, that's totally fine. This is intended to have been handmade. So that's the planer piece. Now this is dry also. It's actually a little bit wet, but I think it will work. I'm going to sand that too. Here, and you can see it kind of builds up. It's different because it is a little bit wet still. I'm going to see what kind of results I get. Flipping it around, rubbing like this. And it's not getting great results. It's actually a little bit wet. So I had just washed this under the sink, and it's taking material away, but it's getting kind of goopy, and you can see the sandpaper is getting wet. So I'm going to hold off on this. So in just a second, once this dries, we'll come back and we'll actually talk about how to scribe, lay out a little hole for this, and how to cut that hole. Okay? So we'll be right back. So the next bit of work we have here is to scribe this piece onto that piece. So in total, again, you will be fitting 3 pieces together. That's the goal of this project. So in this case, as we looked at in an earlier clip, this plaster piece here is this planer piece here, and what I'm doing is I'm creating this mass. This is the mass, so it's a line, a plane, and a volume. I guess you could call it a volume, line, plane, volume. All right, so I need to figure out how and where, or where and how that's going to attach here. And the pencil marks are gone, but that's fine. I get to look at it again and sort of assess and make another decision. I'm going to say it's something like that. That seems pretty good. So what I'm looking at is this reveal here. It's less here and more there. That's important to me. Exactly where it is doesn't matter. And that it's sitting towards the left, or the bottom side down here. think that's good to go. Again, the importance here is not to be exacting, although you can measure exactly. It's a visual exercise in composing these three pieces together. So what I'm going to do is scribe, meaning mark, the location of the smaller piece onto this larger piece. And I'm actually using my knife. In this case, you could use your Olfa knife since it has blades that you can change. I'm actually scraping the surface of it like that, holding the two pieces together. So if I take this away, then you can see it's left a mark right there. Hopefully you can see that. Yes. Now, this next step, I'm guessing, will be the most challenging and perhaps frustrating. And it just takes practice, and it may be that you'll break a piece or two, and you may have to cast a piece again. So we're setting this up that you have all weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, to work on this form. So just be patient, and if you have to do it again, you can always send me an email with any questions that you may have. But if you have to do it again, that's part of working with materials and craft. Second time you do it, or even the third, you'll have a better sense of what it is you need to do to get better results. So I'm going in and I'm cutting, I'm basically tracing this onto the surface with my knife. So plaster is very carvable, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to come from this side over to where I want it here. You can see I made a little notch, and I'm going to flip it. Actually, I'm not going to flip it. I'm going to go here and I'm going to make a little notch here. It absolutely does not matter how you do this. What matters is that you're working incrementally and you're sort of shaving the plaster away like this. So in my case, this is really strong. I don't have to worry as much about sort of cutting and pushing into this edge. This little piece over here is probably pretty fragile. You can imagine, it's quite narrow, and I could break that corner off really easily. So I'm going to go really slowly and just kind of shave this. It's like shaving ice, kind of, or wood. It's even softer than wood. You can see how I'm sort of chipping away at it here and carving, chipping, scraping a little. It's just sneaking up on it. Working slowly. It's totally fine to work slowly. It may take practice to work slowly, but in this case, it's really important, really necessary. And I'm going to keep going here, chipping away at it, getting a little bit deeper, sort of going from both sides, following the line that I scribed on here, and taking away material in the middle. You can see that it has a high spot here because I'm sort of chiseling into it, and I'm going to just now take a little bit of that out. So if you've done any whittling, it's very similar to whittling wood. You could take away material in this way. And always, with any craft, you're going to encounter new challenges. Your shapes are going to be very different than my shapes, and problem solving is part of good craft. You have to think about how can you get the results that you need. So be smart about it. Look at your piece. Listen to and watch and feel for how the plaster is cutting. And I'm getting close. Cutting down, following the line here. And I'm going to go here. Like that. Almost. Pretty exciting. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this piece fits. What I've also done, just to be clear, trying to cover all the bases here, is I've tried to anticipate the size of this. You can see that's really tight. It actually won't fit in there, which is good. I want this to be pretty snug. I can always take more material away, but I cannot easily add material, although we will talk about that. So I'm assuming I'm just taking away the roughing this in, so to speak, and that I'll come in once I have it more or less where I want it, and very gently sort of pare down one of the sides to open up this little opening enough to fit that piece in. So this is starting to be a little fragile, so I'm trying to be really careful about that so I don't just kind of snap that edge off. If you do have something crack and break, you can repair your shape with epoxy glue and patch it. It's not ideal. Partially, it would just be a little more work, but if you can't see, it's starting to get there. And you know, it's just taken me a couple minutes to do this. So let's see how the fit is here. Ooh, look at that. Super snug. Almost. So I have two choices here. I could either sand this down to fit this, or I can continue to shave this off to open this up. I'm also going to try it in multiple directions because this is not perfect. So I want to start to get a sense of exactly which face of this is going to go into this. And I'm actually going to, rather than carving away at this, because this is pretty clean now and also this is fragile, I'm actually going to sand this down just a hair. I want this to fit in like that. So I'm going to take this face off. I'm just going to take 2 quick passes on this. Just going to make this just a little bit narrower. Little bit. Actually, this is not quite. I'm going to shave this down a hair. Like that. Okay. Notching. Wow, look at that. All right. That's it. That's what it's going to be for now. I may make a change. You know, I can still make some decisions about how deep this is, for example, but what I've done is I've notched this in to start to, let's see, this would be this side. Yes, all right. So it's longer here and shorter there, which is what I'm trying to replicate here, like that. All right. Chipboard or corrugated model, quick model. This was 10 minutes. This is going to take a little more time, a couple hours, but I'm now using this to make decisions about how to make this just a little bit better. So the next step is going to be to cast this and notch it in the same way, this linear piece. So all the same steps, making corrugated cardboard form, pouring the plaster. This is really skinny. I may have to make some decisions about this vertical element. I may try it skinny. My guess is it might break, in which case I could make my vertical element a little fatter. And that way, the design is evolving over time. So, all right. So I'm set up here to make the third piece, which in the case of the model I'm working on is this long linear element. So some of these pieces will be challenging to make. This is very skinny. This is also just a prototype. I would like all of you to feel free to make changes as you move from this model to your plaster model in any way that you need to make your design better or stronger, and to also problem solve how to get your best results. So it's not going to be possible for me right now to cast a piece that's exactly like this. What's important is that this is a linear element and that I would like to retain the compositional idea in my final model. So what that means is that I need to have a flush condition down here so it stands. A couple of things. The linear element is on the opposite side of this mass, so I'm going to try to do that too, which means it will be happening over here. And what else? That it's long and skinny, more or less. So proportions are relative, and I'm going to try to make that piece out of this. So what I've done, and this is sometimes a really useful way to make models, is I've actually cast what I'm going to just use as raw material. What I would like to show how to do here is to score and cut this to make smaller pieces. So kind of like going to the lumber yard and buying a sheet of plywood, I'm actually going to make a little rip, a little long skinny piece off of this, hopefully. It might crack, and that'll be okay too. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to lay it on a flat surface here. I'm going to in the same way that we notched that other piece, I'm going to just try. I actually have a steak knife here. You know what? I'm going to use my pocket knife. I'm going to score it. It's called scoring, which basically means scratching it. So this is a technique that's used for cutting lots of different kinds of materials, rigid materials, glass in particular. I'm just going to, so it's like cutting the chipboard. Look at that. See, I have a nice straight line there. I'm going to go all the way around with my pocket knife here like that, so I can see where that line is on the other side. Right there. I'm going to do the same thing here. And just transfer the line across, and so I know that's going to be here. I'm going to actually score the other side also, like this. Line up those ends. I hope you are experiencing how easy Plaster of Paris is to work with. It's kind of a beautiful combination of being very rigid and also very malleable. So the goal with scoring is that you score it deeply enough that it will just crack along that line. I'm going to go ahead and snap this and see how it works. It should just pop pretty easily. So it doesn't quite yet. So it should, if it doesn't just kind of separate on its own, I would score it a little bit more. Just digging into that and making a nice, you know, once I've started with the straight edge, I don't need it anymore. I'm going to try to get a little bit more on the back side too. Pretty much any knife will work for this. Maybe even a butter knife, the butter knife or whatever you used before, pocket knife of some sort. Certainly your Olfa knife will work for this. Hopefully this snaps. Oh, I broke a piece. How about that? So that broke. That's interesting. All right, well, what do I have to work with? I think this is not going to be big enough for this end. It's just going to be too short proportionally. So what I'm trying to do is get that length out of it. All right, so I'm going to try it again. Now I actually have a nice straight edge to work with too, this edge. So I'm going to cut it again, score it again. Like this. Second time is a charm. Something like this. Transfer the edge around like that. Transfer this edge around like that. And then score it. Just going to get the straight line first with the metal edge. And I'm going to kind of do it freehand here. I'm also going to try and score it a little more deeply so that I don't have to put quite as much force on it to crack it off, crack this piece off. Hopefully this will work. Kind of digging away, so it's just like cutting a chipboard. Multiple passes, and that end broke off. Look at that. All right. Don't lose hope. I think this is good. I'm sort of learning as I'm working. I have this material to work with. I'm going to try it one more time, and actually you can see these edges are very variable. This is a little thicker here and a little thinner there, so maybe this is even a better side to work on. I'm just going to keep trying it. One more time. I guess it's not 2 as a charm, it's 3 as a charm, so I'm confident this is going to work. Okay, score. Transfer the edges so I can see where it is on the other side, like that. That piece broke right off, look at that. And then, I have this mark there. Go ahead and score again. Try to get this as parallel as possible. I'd like it to be a fairly straight element. Nice crisp line. I'm just going to really patiently, you know what I'm going to try is I'm going to try to do most of the work here, scoring it, and so I have a little less pressure, snapping it like that. So you see the dust, I'm kind of removing material as I do that. And then also here, the same. So I've chosen to try to cast this long skinny piece in this way. You may actually try to create a form that is exactly the size that you need, and that would be okay too. That's certainly possible to do it that way. Whatever works is best. I'm gonna try to look at that. Oh, very nice. So the next thing we'll do is sand this down to shape. I'm gonna let it dry just a little bit longer. Be right back. So this is a little drier now, and I've cleaned up and come back. I'd just like to share what I'm working on here. This is a little uneven, a little irregular looking, and I am going to try to be very careful. It's very fragile now, and try to clean this up with sandpaper. So the sandpaper is flat on the table, and remember when you're sanding in this way to let the flatness of the table be your guide. So I'm holding, actually this has a little bit of cup to it. Straighten the paper out. So I'm holding the paper down and just going to very gently, holding it like this, so I'm trying to just shave the edges off and try to get it a little more straight and a little more even. I'm going to make a linear element. It doesn't look wonky and sort of organic. I'm trying to get it to look really crisp. And again, you may have to do this several times to get good results, and that's why we're allowing 3 days of our weekend for the fabrication of these models. So that's starting to get a little better. It's pretty parallel like that. This is very uneven here, however, though. You see it's thinner there and thicker there. So what I'm going to do is place this on the paper like this and put a little more pressure on this side so that I take more of this material away. So when I'm doing this, I'm sanding here and not here. I want to leave this. This is already thinner. I'm trying to get this about the same, a little closer. That's better. Flipping it. Oh, it broke again. You know what? I think this is really excellent. I'm kind of glad this happened. I'm going to come back in a minute with my epoxy. I'm going to show you how to fix this. So stay tuned, because I suspect this is something that all of you may encounter. Be right back. So I'm back, and I've had a chance to think about this a little bit, and one option would be to glue this piece like this. I think that could work. You can see that's a really tight joint, so a little teeny dollop of that gel epoxy that you guys should have would really button that up. What I think I'm going to do, though, and I'd like to talk through this process a little bit, is to reconsider my model. So I have these pieces that I'm working with, and now this is what I have as a reference, okay, these proportions. So as you can see here, my reference here, this is really long, this is shorter. If I have something like this, if I were to place this here, you can see it's actually a very different proportion. I think that's fine. That's interesting. So what I might do, what I was thinking about doing, was actually using some of this material from this planer piece, actually cutting it down and using that as my linear element. So sort of cannibalizing some of this and taking the opportunity to fine-tune all of my proportions and work opportunistically to use this nice dry straight piece of plaster here, a strip off of this, and then flip it and use it as the vertical element. So I'll be right back. I'm going to set up and start scoring this piece and do just that. So I'm just going to make a visual guess about this. I think I'd like it to be a little wider, be a little stronger in being a little wider. I'm also looking to make sure that everything here is pretty parallel. Right, so I'm going to scribe this like this. So model making in this way is very messy, both literally and figuratively. Very important to keep your mess controlled, your physical mess of plaster dust and things like that. So don't make an enemy of your friends and roommates or parents or siblings, and keep a tidy ship. Sweep up your dust as you're working, things like that. But it's also messy in the sense that, you know, this is a work in progress. And I'm not working from a set of blueprints knowing exactly what I want. I'm actually using the process of making the model to make decisions to make my design better and to let it evolve. The term that's used in design is generative. This is a generative process, and I'm exploring and experimenting. So this plaster is a little bit easier to work with, this particular casting. And I'm going to go through and scribe this like this. And I'm going to go very slowly because I'd like this to really work out. So I've kind of learned some in the process of trying to get this long linear piece. And let me get it right. So I'll go through on this side. So I'll bring this up closer to the camera so you can see this scribe. It's pretty deep, actually. So I'm going to keep sort of slowly scraping away at this off camera, and I'll come back when I'm ready to actually snap this piece, because I'm going to take my time scribing this piece. Be right back. Right. So I'm hopeful this is going to work. Scribe seems deep enough, and I'll just give it a little snap. Not quite yet. So again, this should really let go. If you're making pieces in this way and cutting them, when the scribe is deep enough, it will just kind of pop and just release. And I guess there's some relationship between how much material you've taken away and how much is left. And I need to take a little bit more. Right. Keep going here. So maybe, if nothing else, this demonstration will encourage you to try to cast your pieces and not scribe and cut. We'll see. This is maybe providing you with an example of what not to do. And again, I'm just sharing my experience of modeling and trying to problem solve how to get good results. So we'll see here. I'm hopeful. Maybe that's deep enough. Yes, it is. Look at that. I think I'm going to like these proportions a lot better, actually. I already took a big sigh of relief here. It's a little shorter, and then this is going to be taller, and I'm going to call that good. I love that. Interesting. Very nice proportions. I think this reads much better now that it's a little more axial this way. All right, I'm going to sand these pieces out and then get set up to notch them. So something like this, again, clean up the edges like that. Looking good. And I'm also then going to need to clean this one up too, because that's the edge that I snapped and cut. Right, it's a good looking edge. Okay, so now the decision I have is to decide where this vertical element is going to go. So this one is set like that. So this as a visual reference is really good to have. You know, remember and go back to this and see that these are really close together. So this piece needs to lay out about like that. I like that a lot. That's going to be nice. Hopefully it will still balance. So having this flush at the bottom is an important part of these balancing. It's going to rest on these 2 points. So what that means is that the distance here has to be the same as the distance here. So it will sit like that. I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to scribe this. I'm going to make a little mark. You know, I have found actually that scribing is the best with plaster. Scraping it basically. Right like that. Okay, take this away. There it is. Little marks. where I want my notch to be. Okay, excellent. Now I'm going to go through the same process that we did with this piece and carefully shave a little notch into it like this. So one of the questions I'm asking myself right now is, how deep do I have to make this notch? I can make it as deep as I would like it to be, as deep as it needs to be to communicate the concept. And maybe, since this piece is so small, maybe it doesn't need to be very deep at all, just enough to connect it visually to the horizontal surface. So I'm just going to kind of very carefully shave away a little bit, and then I'm going to check it, see how it looks. All right, so I'm shaving this down, and it's just a little notch, just a little bit of a notch. I'm going to check it here to see how it looks. I want it to fit right like that. It does, kind of. Maybe we can take it a little bit more than that. Right, you see how it has a little bit of a notch? I think it needs just a little bit more, but I'm trying to balance the proportions between what I have here of the vertical element and how much it engages this upper side, or this face of the planar element. If this is a little deeper, it's going to move this way a little bit more and then kind of engage that piece. I don't want it to go very far, so I'm just going to take it a little bit more. Like that. So I'm definitely using my eye, and I'm looking down, sighting down this and trying to get this nice and even. Inescapably, a part of craft is just developing a good eye, and all of your projects already have a really good sense of that. So just keep at it, and what I can say is to just be really patient. Don't rush this process. And you'll get good results. So this piece is going to fit just like that. I need to take a little bit more out of this corner to get it to fit tightly. You guys can hear that my cats and dog are ready to be fed. They're swirling around my feet here in the kitchen, so that looks pretty good. It's going to want to sit like that. All right, very promising. I think it's going to work. Be something like that, and I get to decide how I'm going to glue it up. I would like it to sit flat like this also, so these edges are going to align as well. And there we are. 1, 2, 3 pieces. 3 casts, 2 cuts. So we can talk through exactly how to make these decisions, but you get the idea. Try to do as little as possible. I chose not to cut this and cut this instead. And then next I chose to just very lightly notch this so that it would fit onto this piece like that. Now I have these 3 separate pieces. I'm going to clean them up with sandpaper just a little bit, and the next step is to actually use the gel epoxy and epoxy them into place. Well, we're nearing the home stretch here. I've kind of cleaned these up a little bit, and we just saw the last step of notching this piece so that it fits. It's just a little notch, a little teeny notch like that, just enough to capture that edge. This can also be called a register, a number of names for this. So I made a decision, very conscious decision, and this part of modeling is a design process and helps you push your project further, better, hopefully stronger, cleaner, in letting the dimensions of the material in this case help determine what your design should be. So I needed to connect this. I didn't want to just have it sitting right on the side like that. And I do need to connect it in this way. So I'm trying to work with this as a reference, although it's already quite different both in length and width, which is perfectly fine. It's a good thing. It's going to go somewhere like this, and so I decided to just barely nick it. It was only like a 1/16 of an inch maybe, or maybe a little bit more, 3/32, just a little register like that. So we now have 3 pieces, 3 independent pieces, 3 free-floating pieces, and you can see really clearly a volume, a mass, a line, and a planar element. So our next step is to actually glue them together. I happen to have a Gorilla Glue. The glue that was specified on the materials list is a blue container, and I don't recall the name. Epoxy gels are pretty much all the same. What is important in the glue that you're using is that it be a gel. A super glue gel, it needs to bond quickly, so you shouldn't have to hold it for minutes. This, I think, claims to bond in 10 seconds. And with being a gel, what it will do is it will just sit on the surface and it won't run. So often you'll find little packets of glue like this at CVS and other places, which, by the way, I got this at CVS also. It was $4 for this bottle. This is liquid. It's like water, and it's just, while it's appropriate for certain applications, it would be completely and utterly frustrating to work with in this circumstance. It would run all over and stain the plaster of Paris. So make sure that you're working with a gel, and it does need to be a quick setting epoxy, so not the tacky glue. All right, so just as we have conceived of these as 3 separate pieces, working incrementally, first making one, then another, and fitting it, I would strongly recommend gluing up your pieces in a similar fashion. So I already have a really good sense of where this one needs to be. It's going to be something like this. It'll be right like that. It's going to be short on this side and long on this side. Another way to look at it is here, like that, and I'm just going to go for it. You're going to make a decision. It's going to be a little bit longer here and a little bit shorter on that side. Actually, I already have a pencil mark there. I'm going to flip it. I think I did make a little pencil mark. Pencil marks can easily sand away, and if you need to make a little mark to remind yourself of where you need to be, it's a good thing. So I've made that pencil mark here, and I'm even going to put a little X on that side. So that's where I know I need to put the glue. And then I'm just going to go for it. Take the top off. Like with other glues, I had to trim the little nib off of this, and I am going to actually apply the glue on the inside here. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Just kind of do what makes the most sense for you. And I'm just going to put like a little bead. It's really easy, as it is with the tacky glue, to get too much glue. So I will try to bring this up to the camera, and you can take a look. This does not need to hold up, an elephant. It just needs to hold together and be strong enough to serve its purpose. So I don't know if you can see that. It's just a tiny little bit of glue. It's actually, I left the glue a little bit short of the edge. Okay. So next I'm going to stick this in there. I'm ready. I have the pencil mark. So really important when you're gluing up is to look at your model and make sure that you're using your eye to square it up. So it's really easy to glue it and have this be sort of a little wonky, cocked to the side or something like that. If that happens, it's totally fine. It's the worst case scenario is you just have to crack it apart and do it again. But I'm just going to stick that in there like that. So the advantage of epoxy is it sets really quickly. I'm going to hold it by hand like this, and I'm turning it and looking at it multiple directions and kind of making sure it's square. I think that's pretty good, and I am putting pressure on it. Putting pressure, I'm pushing it together, and I'm holding it long enough for the glue to kick. I'm hoping that's going to be pretty good. I think that's going to be it. All right. So far, so good. Something like that. How is that? I'm going to look at it. I still have a little bit of room to move, actually. So now I'm using the table here, too, as a pressure point. That looks pretty good. Using the pencil line as a reference. and I'm continuing to put pressure on it. So maybe 30 seconds has gone by, 45 seconds, and I'm still putting pressure on it. I'm moving it around, lining it up this way, and looking at it in relationship to this second piece. So very important to go back in any project to the goals and the criteria, and one of the big important goals here is to try to define axial relationships. So I'm trying to keep this really clean. I have one axis moving this way and one axis moving that way. Another way to think of it is that, or to consider this, is that this is perpendicular to this piece here. This inside angle should be 90 degrees. So I think that's looking pretty good. This is already pretty hard, and you can see it actually doesn't sit, which is a good thing. Okay, because I'm going to go back in, and I am going to place this piece here. You know what I did do? Actually, this is good. Maybe this will, is I actually forgot to consider the relationship of this piece to that one. These surfaces need to line up, because I'd like it to sit this way as one of the balance points, right? And they don't, but it can. This piece I can move around, so I'm going to hopefully crack this apart. Give it a pull it apart. Look at that. Came right off. Totally fine. So I'm actually going to go back in really quickly, clean that epoxy off with my knife. Good deal. Easy. No problem. This has some gook in there. I would definitely, if you do have to re-glue your piece, clean it up before you glue it again. So, because the epoxy does stay on the surface and it won't. You just need to have a clean joint again. So that's pretty good. I'm going to clean this surface off too. So I need to reconsider how I'm going to lay this out because honestly I forgot. I forgot that these needed to line up. So I'm going to have one piece like this, and then this one has to go in like that, kind of like a little finger puzzle. So what I need to have happen is I need to have these edges flush like that, so that they will sit flat. So I'm gonna, even though this piece isn't gonna be exactly where it is, I'm gonna slide it out a little bit. I'm using this as a measuring stick. So it's gonna be about that thick. Great. Now I know where that needs to be. I'm gonna go ahead and put a pencil mark there. That's my new mark. I'm gonna do it again. All right, so now I know these two go together. I'm gonna put a little X here to remind myself of which side that's on. I'm gonna have a go at it again. More glue. So just a little bead. You know, if it does overflow, that is okay too. Probably if you had to choose, it's better to have enough glue and have it be strong than to have your joint be what's called a dry joint, which is just not quite enough. So actually I'm trying to learn from this process and gluing it together. When I put this together, I'm actually going to bring this other piece on there too, just to make sure it's in the right place. So here I go. That goes on there like that. I also did put a little more glue on it. So holding it together like that. I'm going to double check this measurement here. I'm pretty sure it's good, but that is going to be like that. Yes, good, it's going to work. Okay, so now before this glue dries, I'm going to hold it here really firmly. Okay, looking good. Keep it there. So while I'm holding it here, I do have some glue that's kind of leaked out a little bit. It's looking a little gross, a little goopy. So you take a piece of cardboard, clean that off using a corner like that. I'm gonna go back over here onto this side and actually wipe it off too. I could scrape this off later, but the more I do now, the less I have to do later, and the cleaner it'll be. So I am assuming, here we are, tick tock, 30 seconds, 45 seconds maybe. Hoping this is pretty good. It'll be something like that. Yay, right. Looking good, it's pretty strong. So this was under a minute. My guess is it's gonna take a little while for this glue to really cure. It's strong enough that even if I bump it like that, this won't move now. So it's pretty amazing. It's almost like magic. So the next piece I'm gonna put, I've already sized. It's gonna be something like this. So decisions, insofar as this is still a work in progress and you're making design decisions, if I look at this model here, this is really close to this, right? It happens to balance. This one balances in this case as is, which is really important to me. So I'm going to have 2 balance points in this. This one, however, if I actually did a similar, I noticed if I do a similar proportion here, this wants to tip over. It's just a little heavy, okay? Totally fine. I'm changing materials. Plaster is really heavy. What's happening is there's a really heavy moment arm here, meaning this is carrying more weight and pulling it over. So what I have to do to get that balance point, and why it's really important to pay attention to your model when you're making it, pay attention to the criteria. I want this to be able to stand and balance. So I'm going to shift this over, and this is totally my decision exactly where this goes. I'd like it to be closer to what this is, and I like the proportions, kind of the offset here. This is almost thirds, actually, 1/3 and 2/3. That looks pretty good. If I moved that over, so actually as I move it even closer over this way, maybe you can see that from here, how, to my eye anyway, this becomes more static, less interesting. I think because these 2 ends are equal, like this distance, starting to become very equal to this distance here, similar, and it starts to feel kind of static. I really like the cantilever here, the way this projects out. That actually is a really important takeaway from this, again, so just to sort of the last time circle around this idea of this being a generative model. This is just to leverage an idea forward. I'm making changes, all of the proportions here are changing. So I'm gonna, to sort of make the best decisions for this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna keep sliding this way until it fails, until it tips over. And then I'll kind of know what that threshold is. Keep moving it over. Look at that still stays. How about that? I kind of like that. I'm going to stop there, because if I moved this any further over this way, this will be right in the middle, and I don't really want this to be centered on this plane. I want it to be slightly offset. Why is that? It's just kind of an instinct for keeping the harmony and the balance of this as a piece. Generally speaking, when you center something on something else, it becomes a really strong visual element, and I actually don't want that. I don't want this to call attention to itself by being symmetrically placed on this plane. So I'm going to pull it this way a little bit more. I'm just going to call that good. Something like that. Great. So I'm going to mark that with a pencil, just so I know where it is. Really exciting, kind of the final steps here. You can see how that lines up here like this. Boy, sure would be nice if this stood this way. I don't think it's going to happen on this model though, so I'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, so you can see what I'm also doing is I'm staging the model, and I know it's here, dry fit. Just going to take this right over here, and it's ready to go. I'm going to set it to the side. I'm going to place the glue here where I know it needs to be, the epoxy, like that. And I'm going to put just a little bit on the end because I know this turns the corner there like that. And here. I have to say this for me is a very satisfying part of the model because the epoxy kicks really quickly. And all of a sudden, in a couple of minutes, you're done. All right, so I'm holding this here in place. This is such a small, lightweight piece. It's just like it immediately took. It's already glued. Okay, so really important, I can't emphasize this enough, for these to work really well, is to keep an eye on your model as you're working it. So when I place this here, what I'm looking for is to get this piece parallel to this edge. You can even measure it, so this distance to here should be the same in my model as this distance is to here. Okay? That's what's going to make these models really sing, is to get them lined up, to get all your edges parallel, and just be working with proportional shifts. So now this should work as a balancing point. I think it does. Very slightly. Yeah, that'll work. All right. I'm going to take a look at it here. See, it should balance like this also. Very exciting. So I'll take some pictures of this, and we can look at this in studio to kind of examine the subtleties of it, but this is it. The very last step, which we will do here in a minute, just need to go get some plaster, is to actually fill these cracks, dressing out the joints to make them feel really solid, really uniform. So that is just more of an aesthetic finishing detail, but it is important. It makes a difference, and it'll be the final step for this to really start to sing as a model. Okay, there it is, all done. Okay, this is the final step. Here we are, final piece. It's pretty strong. What's important is that it holds together. It is still a very delicate piece, fragile, meaning, you know, if I bumped this, it would probably crack. Something might fall apart, but take care of it. It is what it is. It's Plaster of Paris, and it's a means to an end. Kind of taken the ideas that were started here in this quick sketch model and pushed it forward into something that has material form. A couple of things were discovered about weight, proportions, what's needed to get this to cantilever in the way that it is. And I think it's gotten better in some ways. Maybe it's gotten a little bit weaker in some other ways, but I am ready to accept this for what it is, I guess. I think overall I'm pretty satisfied. I do think I could look at it critically, which hopefully we can do together, talk about the ways that you can evaluate and consider your work sort of post-operatively to assess it and determine and take notes about what you might do differently in the future. But here we are. So this last little step is a small thing, but it is really important, I think, to get good results, especially if you're talking about photographing this for a portfolio. But in general, the spirit of this project is that you are making a monolithic piece that feels whole. It has a gestalt, has a singularity to it. So if you zoom in here, you can see these joints are pretty clean, meaning they don't have a little shadow line. They don't look like they're two different pieces that are put together with a crack, ragged edges. What I've done on this is I've gone in and patched this with a plaster slurry, which is exactly what we're going to do now on this also. So if we look here, for example, this is pretty good joint, I think. It's pretty tight, but there is a little bit of glue, a little bit of the epoxy, and there's a little bit of some gapping, which is totally fine. It's as good as I could get it. So what I want to do is make a little slurry of plaster, and I actually have a tiny little cup now. I would recommend mixing as little plaster as possible. This is actually I'm quite sure this had soy sauce in it from a recent to-go food order, so saved it, and now it's a little mixing cup. All right, a tiny bit of water, just needs a little drink. It's surprising to me always how little water plaster and other things like this already. Wow, look at that, too much water. That's really liquidy. So no problem, just go back into it and add a little bit more plaster, get it to I'd like it to be for this kind of slurry. It does need to have some thickness, but it also shouldn't be like paste. It needs to kind of be like a gel, kind of. That's pretty good. Maybe a little bit more plaster. One, yeah, we'll call that good. I think that'll work. Okay, mixing it around. Have a fair amount of time to work here with plaster. It doesn't harden as quickly as the epoxy, as you've already discovered, I'm sure. All right, I'm going to call that good. I think that's about good enough. All right, so what I'm going to do here, and you can use anything for this, any tool, plastic knife, my pocket knife is something that I could probably use. In fact, I'll start with that. I'm just going to take a little drink of plaster here. I'm going to go in and fill the corner with it. It's like using a little putty knife, like that. It's going to have a little bit of surface to it, a little bit of texture, but that's actually totally fine. It's better to fill in these cracks and have a little bit of surface texture, and the surface texture too is something that you can sand out later if you'd like. And I'm just going to go around to all of the edges here, all the way around. In particular here, you can see probably that gapping here. There's quite a bit of gap there. So I'm going to go in and fill it here too, like that, all the way around. In fact, I'm overfilling it, knowing that I can, once it dries, I can scrape away that plaster and clean it up a little bit. So it's like spackling a wall, if you've ever done that, filling a hole, a nail hole in a wall. Kind of overfill it first and then sand it back to the finish that you're looking for. So I'm actually starting to get really generous with it here, which is because I'm working quickly, because I'd like to get this finished, as I know you will want to as well. So wouldn't belabor this and try to get it perfect. Just get those cracks filled, and then you can come back and scrape it and sand it. It'll be much quicker that way and actually much more effective. When you overfill something, a crack like this, what it allows you to do is to come back and actually sand it or scrape it smooth so that it's just nice and flush to the surface. So filling all these little cracks here all the way around, and I'll show you. It actually dries. It's fascinating actually, because the plaster of Paris is actually really porous, and so this new wet mixture has a lot of water in it, and this does not anymore have as much water. What ends up happening is that this dry plaster kind of drinks the water out of this filler material, and so you'll discover that the filler material very quickly becomes pasty and sort of unworkable, and you can see it's kind of flaky here. So you got to kind of, it just takes a little practice. Got to get it on there and smear it really quickly. And that's looking pretty good. I'm getting close. Here we are, all the edges. Like that. All right. So going through and checking all of them. I got all these edges. Went all the way around. I got that. Got this. That's it. That's done. I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to clean off my pocket knife. So butter knife, pocket knife, steak knife, carving knife, paring knife. Could even be, I have this chipboard here. Sometimes I would just go to grab whatever you have. Actually, this works really well. So this chipboard is softer than the plaster. And what it's doing then is it's just sort of, I'm able to shape the finish like that. Use this corner to come in like that. That's nice. That actually works really well. All right. Well, new discovery. Highly recommend the chipboard shaping tool here. And I'm going to let that dry. Clean off the tool a little bit. Getting a nice irregular finish to things. So keep an eye on the surfaces of your model. Like I mentioned before, it's okay to have texture. Texture is actually really nice in a hand-finished piece of study model like this. Does not need to be perfect. One way to think about it is kind of similar to drawing, is that I would just try to have it be consistent to itself. So whatever kind of irregular marks you have, which there are probably going to be a lot, just try to make them consistently happen across the surface. So I have little scratches, and here, last little bit here. This is actually a perfect shaping tool. Just one of the scraps of chipboard. I'm really happy with this. You can see how I'm sort of cleaning the corners like that, and here. All right, very exciting. It's all done. And voila.